السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Gems of the Heart, where we discuss matters of the heart and how to purify it the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from it. And as we heard many times before, that this is one of the jobs of the messengers of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them to purify the hearts of the people, because that's the purpose of this life, and that is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone by itself is the purification of our hearts and our souls. And if a person associate partners with Allah, that means the heart is contaminated, it's not pure, it is not fit for that heart to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same thing with committing sins. Sins pollute the hearts, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in more than one hadith. And our duty in this life is to make sure that we are constantly cleaning our hearts the same way that we are constantly physically cleaning ourselves. And you see how it's very related, very closely related, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create physical things to become cleared for us also the non-physical aspects of things. So the same way that we have to clean constantly our homes and ourselves, otherwise a person becomes not clean. The same thing with these hearts. These hearts, if it's not constantly cleaned, and there are means to clean it of course, then it becomes polluted. And when it's polluted, then a person is not able to see what is right and what is wrong anymore. The illnesses and the diseases of the hearts that is widespread on the face of earth, that would make people associate partners with Allah, that would make people disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, commit crimes, whether it's to their own selves only or to others, and commit injustices and so on. All of that is because of the pollution of one's heart. The hearts are not purified. The same thing when a person finds himself neglecting the orders of Allah, not waking up for Salatul Fajr, for example. That's a sign that there is something in the heart. It's not just about the physical actions, it's about something being present in the heart. And oftentimes when people try to seek cure to their physical problems or their actions, say for example someone wants to wake up for the Fajr Salah. How can that person take the means to wake up for the Fajr Salah? It's not just about setting the alarm and sleeping early and so on. It's about curing what disease in the heart that preventing the person from waking up for the Salah, whether it's the yaqeen, the certainty, sins that affects the person, and so on and so forth. So this is something that is so important for us to pay attention to our hearts. And the only way for us to do that is to read the Book of Allah. The Book of Allah cures the hearts, to have the proper belief, and that's the foundation. And that's what we've been talking about throughout many episodes from the very beginning, about the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're still in the subject of the names and attributes of Allah. We're taking every episode the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or some of the attributes of Allah, and how can that purify our hearts? How can we live our life with these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And in this episode, inshallah ta'ala, we'll talk about one of the beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is very important, very magnificent and powerful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose that name to be present in a surah that whoever recited, as the Prophet ﷺ said, as if he recited 1/3 of the Quran, even though that particular name is only mentioned one time in the Quran. We know that there are many names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are repeated all the time. As-Sami', Al-Basir, and so on and so forth. We have this so many times in the Quran. But this one particular name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only mentioned one time, only once in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the name As-Samad. The name As-Samad. This is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, As-Samad, and it's mentioned in the surah that we all know, the surah that we all memorize. Even if you're very young, you have it memorized, which is surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad. Qul Huwallahu Ahad, we don't need to memorize it. Everybody probably know the surah very well. And the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, As-Samad, is mentioned there. So let's look into this beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what does it really mean in this beautiful surah, which is 1/3 of the Quran, as the Prophet ﷺ, he said. We know the surah, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم, قل هو الله أحد, الله الصمد, لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد, which means say he is Allah who is one, Allah as-Samad, لم يلد ولم يولد, he neither begets nor is born, ولم يكن له كفوا أحد, nor is there to him any equivalent. So what does as-Samad means? As-Samad means, and it has more than one meaning, but the meaning that the word or the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as-Samad means, it means the one that all of his creation, they are in need of him, that they are all in state of need to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that all of their affairs cannot be fulfilled unless it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's basically the entire names and attributes of Allah can have a relationship with the name As-Samad. That's why it's only mentioned once, as many of the ulama they say. Others they say the naming of it is As-Sayyid, the one, the master of all things, the one that everybody depends on. And this word As-Samad comes from something that is very strong, that everybody, all the creation of Allah, again as we said, they're all in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He does not need of them whatsoever. That's why when you see maybe the translation of As-Samad is the eternal refuge, that everybody is in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all times, with every breath we take, with matters of guidance and to be protected, with life itself, everything. And therefore, this name is mentioned when the disbelievers, they asked the Prophet ﷺ, they said, Insib lana rabbak. That means, give us the lineage of your Lord. Who is your Lord? Who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So this surah, as we said, it's 1/3 of the Quran, is a surah that we recite many times throughout the day. It's from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to recite this surah and the last two surahs in the Quran after each salah one time, and after Maghrib salah 3 times, and after Isha, after Fajr salah 3 times. And that means of protection for the person throughout the night and means of protection throughout the day. So this is a very serious matter, and that's why whoever reflect upon the meaning when reciting the surah, then you get the rewards of reciting 1/3 of the Quran. As the ulama, they say not every person recites Qul Huwallahu Ahad will get 1/3 of the Quran as if he recited it, but rather the more the person reflect upon the meaning of it and know the meaning of what he's saying, and having that belief in the heart, this is the means of purification, and this is how a person would get this great reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we really think about this word As-Samad, when we think about the life of the human beings and how we are all deficient, human beings by default are deficient. They cannot sustain their life without something else. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us that we have insides. Inside of us, we have to fill, or we have to have something that goes inside of our bodies to sustain our life. Like we have to eat and drink. We have to think about this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the one that is able to do all things. He could have made us in such a way that there's nothing inside of us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have anything in the inside, as Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said the meaning of As-Samad. That means He's not like the human beings. They need to eat. They need to sustain their life by putting something inside of them, in their jawf, in their ahsha, in their guts, in their stomach, and so on. That by itself is a weakness. That many human beings, they don't reflect upon this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to see this in ourselves. That how we are when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, how weak we are as human beings. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will for provisions to be not anymore on the face of earth, we don't have power, we don't have any might whatsoever. So why the arrogance? And that's why the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His name, that we have to have this in our hearts. Our hearts has to be full of that need, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our eternal refuge. We are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He does not need us whatsoever. So the fact that we have to sustain our life, we have to eat, we have to put things inside of us from the creation of Allah for us to grow, to sustain our life. And that's all by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who's the one that give us life? When we don't give our life, we don't give ourselves life itself. It's owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We do not own or control that we keep our life. If the moment of death comes, the entire world and whatever it contains cannot even push for one breath, extra one, for a person to live an extra second on the face of earth. It's all by the power of Allah. People see how human beings are in such a state of being overpowered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the power of Allah. They have no say whatsoever. They are so weak. But still, this is where ignorance comes in place. People might think so much that they are in no need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they live their life and they eat by the power of Allah, from the provisions of Allah, and they disbelieve in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or they say words that they don't need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and so on. Well, let them live somewhere where they can eat or provide for them from other than the creation of Allah, when He's the creator of all things. They did not even create it, they did not make it for their own selves. So As-Samad again gives that way of life that's supposed to change the entire life of a human being. That the entire perspective of this life is totally different than what people are in state of forgetfulness. That a person sees how weak and how deficient and how we are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so the person will act accordingly. And this example, we mentioned it many times before, is like when a person is in the middle of the ocean hanging to a log of wood. He is in such a state of necessity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he's not thinking about any other means except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help him, and he's seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That person is not of more in need than someone living or staying in the comfort of his home. Why? Because we're all in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially when it comes to matters of guidance. So let's change the way that we recite the Quran. Let's change the way that we purify our hearts when we recite a surah like Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So when we say Qul Huwallahu Ahad, we have to mean it, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, is the only one. Allahu Samad, He's the eternal refuge. That means we don't need anyone but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to have, this is another action, that we have to be in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is an action done by the heart that purifies it. It's not just a belief, to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala we're all in need of, and also to do an act of worship in our hearts by being in need of Allah, by having this in our heart, by being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we are provided for. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala denied any equivalence to Him whatsoever, and any like to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is established in the word As-Samad. Because As-Samad means everything is in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is in no need of everyone. And therefore, nothing is the like of Allah. That's why the significance of mentioning right after that, لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ, that He neither begets nor is born. Because those who claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, has a son, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exalted over this. This is such a wrongdoing and injustice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to claim that He has a son. Having a son, that means He's like the human being, equivalent to the human beings. That means people, they have sons because they are in need of having sons to help them, and so on and so forth. So the equivalence and being in need, that is denied from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no equivalent to Him, and there is no need whatsoever to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because everything is in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not the opposite. And that's why it's mentioned right after that, لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ, that He neither begets nor is born, because He is a Samad. Everybody is in need of Him, and He is in no need of anyone whatsoever. When we look into this name, since we're reciting it again every day many times, we need to make sure that we understand it, we reflect upon it, and we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with it by reciting Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and also by using this name in our dua. We can use this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our dua. There's a hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he heard a man saying, and that's maybe it's a good opportunity for us to memorize this dua, that the man was saying, Allahumma inni as'aluka anni ashhadu annaka anta Allah, la ilaha illa ant, al-ahadu as-samad, alladhi lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. So this is the dua that this man was saying. Big portion of the dua is part of the surah of Qul Allahu Ahad that we already have it memorized. So the man was saying, Allahumma inni, O Allah, I indeed as'aluka, I ask you, anni ashhadu, that indeed I bear witness, annaka anta Allah, that indeed you are Allah, la ilaha illa ant, there is no one worthy of worship except you, al-ahad, as-samad. This is the part of the surah, al-ahad as-samad, the one, as-samad, the one that everybody stands in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alladhi lam yalid wa lam yulad, the one that was never begotten nor he was born. Walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, and there is no equivalent to him. So when the Prophet ﷺ heard this, he said, لَقَدْ سَأَلْتَ اللَّهَ بِالْإِسْمِ الَّذِي إِذَا سُئِلَ بِهِ أَعْطَى وَإِذَا دُعِيَ بِهِ أَجَابَ. Very powerful and a very benefiting hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, you indeed asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the name that if he is asked subhanahu wa ta'ala by this name, he will give. And if he is invoked and a person make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using this name, he would respond to the invocation to the dua. Al-Ismul A'zam, or the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is something that the ulama talked about, because meaning that if a person uses the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his dua is accepted. And many people, they make up things, or many people, they have ijtihad of what is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-A'zam, whether it's al-Hayy al-Qayyum, as some of the hadith mention, or this dua as the Prophet ﷺ said. So this is an opportunity for the dua to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that person, his dua was accepted because he understood he was saying what he was saying. That's why this is such an important and a powerful means to have the dua accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So inshallah ta'ala we'll try our best to memorize this dua, and big portion of it is easy, as we heard, because it has the surah of Qul Allahu Ahad. It shows again here an act of worship for us to use the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our dua, in our invocation, in making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Going back to the name As-Samad. The way that if we, as the ulama they explain, since it's only mentioned one time in the Quran, you can relate many of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to this name As-Samad. Because when people turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being in need of Allah, what are they are in need of? What other people are in need of? They are in need of life itself. Because they seek that from Al-Hayy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ever-living. He is Al-Wahhab. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is the bestower of life and the bestower of provisions and so on. So people, when they become in need of that, they are basically worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the name As-Samad, because they are in need of Allah. The same thing when it comes to people are in need of provisions from Allah. The believers, they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this. Disbelievers, they don't, or some they do. But when they don't, still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provide for them. So the provisions is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the believers, they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it. And they understand why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provide for them to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So this is a need. Whether it's with matters of provisions, or it has in itself that the person believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is As-Samad, that He's the one that everybody is in need of. The same thing when it comes, for example, to one of the needs of the human beings, or should be the most important one, and that is the need of guidance. That we need to be guided. And even something that we should call others, disbelievers, to pay attention to this. Seek guidance from the one that created you. He's the one that owns guidance. So seek guidance from Him. Be in need of Him. Many people on the face of earth, they are disbelievers, but they believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they don't have in themselves that they are in need of Allah. And that's something that makes them away more and more from guidance. If a person wants to see the truth, they all should agree that we are all in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why not seek guidance from Him? When we as Muslims were ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran to seek guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every day, at least 17 times in the 5 daily prayers, when we say Ihdina as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. We are in need of it. Nobody would say, well, I'm already guided, so why should I seek guidance? And if you really reflect even more, who on the face of earth in their religion they would have this in their religion. They would ask guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly in that amount of numbers every day, except the religion of the truth that has the absolute truth in it. Many people, they take religion, whatever they are upon, for granted. He just born and raised and he found himself doing one thing and he continues to be the same way. But this is not necessarily the truth. The truth is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not from the forefathers, not from the parents. So we are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be guided, and that's why we as Muslims, we seek help from Allah, we seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us. And the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, of course, this is the guidance. And the same thing with everything that we do in our life. So being in need of the most important thing, which is guidance, be in need to be staying on guidance and steadfastness on the deen of Allah. This is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we cannot attain this except from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Worldly things, the benefits of matters of deen, da'wah, making the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala superior, eating, drinking, the salt and the food, in any of relationships between husband and wife. It's not just your means that you're taking, or your actions, or your personality. It's all by the help of Allah. So we take the means fully, and we seek help. We are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise, you might not have your wife the way that you want her to be, and the same thing for the wife of the husband. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran about Prophet Ismail, for example, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rectified his wife for him, made her righteous for him. وَأَصْلَحْنَا لَهُ زَوْجَهُ, that we made his wife righteous for him. And see how it's mentioned clearly in the Quran. Not that he was the reason why his wife is righteous. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made his wife righteous for him. But why? إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ وَيَدْعُونَنَا رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا. That means they used to be in haste in doing good deeds. And they would invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the rewards, and out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made his wife righteous for him. So when a person is obedient to Allah, when we are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by worshipping Him with the name As-Samad, therefore all matters of goodness will happen to us. The strongest person and the most one that is favored on the face of earth, the one that feels that he has no power and might and nothing whatsoever, so he turns to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Opposite to what human being might feel. They might think that the more that I take matters in my own hand and I know that what is good for me, so I go get it and so on. Physically, yes, a Muslim is ordered to take the means fully, definitely, no doubt. But the difference is in hearts here again, is that the hearts of the Muslim, the heart of the Muslim is fully in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because even the step we take is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, guidance from Allah. So taking the means while the heart's fully, completely in that state of need. And that's how a person becomes very powerful, relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All means becomes easy for him by the will of Allah. It's a beautiful name of Allah, As-Samad, in a beautiful surah, 1/3 of the Quran. We'll talk more about it inshallah ta'ala after the break, so stay with us inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back, and still with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, As-Samad. This beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is mentioned one time only in the Quran, but one time in the surah that whoever recites it as if he recited 1/3 of the Quran. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ, when he said to his companions, أَيَعْجَزُ أَحَدُكُمْ أَنْ يَقْرَأَ ثُلُثَ الْقُرْآنِ فِي لَيْلَةٍ. He said, would one of you not able to recite 1/3 of the Quran in one night? So this felt difficult for the companions radiallahu anhum to recite 1/3 of the Quran in one night. So the Prophet ﷺ left them, and then after that he explained to them that whoever recites قُلْ اللَّهُ أَحَدٍ in one night as if he recited 1/3 of the Quran. Such a great blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but with that we have to make sure that we give so much importance to that surah, because it's only few verses, 4 verses, very short, but the meanings of it, basically the entire 1/3 of the Quran is mentioned in this one surah. And one of the things that are mentioned in the surah is Allahu Samad, the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's the only place that it's mentioned. So it talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that all of the different names and attributes that people worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with, they are basically in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the meaning of As-Samad, as we said. And it also comes with the meaning of As-Sayyid, the master of all things. And another meaning that the ulama mentioned is Al-Hayyul Qayyum. And this is something that Ibn Kathir and others, they mention also. This is one of the meanings of it. And Al-Hayyul Qayyum is mentioned in some of the hadith about Al-Ismul A'zam, or the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Hayy, the ever living. Al-Qayyum also means the one that everything is in need of him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So both means As-Samad. And this is something that even gives more power to the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to this attribute for people to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we heard the dua that the Prophet ﷺ heard from this companion, and he said that you've asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his greatest name, that if he's asked with it, he will give, he would respond to the dua. There is the ayat of the Quran that explains this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are basically the entire Quran. And one of which is, as we said, that human beings, they need to eat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not eat and does not need to eat, because he's the one that is owner of all things. And this is the meaning of what's mentioned in Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad after Allahu Samad. Because some said that the meaning of a Samad is what's mentioned after it in the same surah, Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, which is لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. That he is never begot. That means he's neither begets nor is born, and nor is there to him any equivalent. So that's the meaning of a Samad. And the significance of لم يلد ولم يولد, that he neither begets nor is born, because whoever is born, that means he has to die. If someone is born, that means before he was born, he was dead, he was nothing, and now he's born. He's given life after being nothing, or after death, basically. So that means he is someone that is going to die again. So he does not deserve to be the creator of the heavens and the earth, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hayy, the ever living. So لم يلد ولم يولد, this is the meaning of As-Samad. And therefore, if that's the case, then he does not sustain his life from something else, from his creation, eating and drinking. And that's why those who claim that Isa alayhi salam, the prophet of Allah, to be the son of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he used to eat and drink. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the Quran, that Isa alayhi salam and his mother, Jesus the son of Mary, they both كَانَا يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ, they both used to eat food. Why this is mentioned in the Quran, and it's left like this for human being to reflect upon it, that those who eat food, that means they are deficient by nature, not deficient in a negative way. They are a great messenger of Allah, and one of the most honored to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But being human being, being someone in need of Allah, Isa alayhi salam, his high level and his high status of being one of the great messengers of Allah is when he was in the servitude of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So he used to eat food for people to think and reflect. Sometimes people think of idol worshipping as this is something very silly, which is of course silly. When we're growing up and seeing the stories of how the people of Quraysh building images and making images and worshipping besides Allah, of course it's very obvious how this is opposing the truth and opposing the nature of the human beings. It's the same thing for anybody worshipping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether they physically make a statue of that thing that they worship besides Allah, or having in their hearts the belief to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially when that it's other than Allah eats and drinks, and therefore they will die. They're sustaining their life by some of the creation of Allah, so how can they be divine? So knowing the name As-Samad keeps the person on the Tawheed. He would never be shaken by all of these false beliefs, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the heavens and the earth, the one that deserves to be worshipped, he does not eat food, and he does not begets, and nor he is born. Therefore also that he does not eat food. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran about himself subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَهُوَ يُطْعِمُ وَلَا يُطْعَمُ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yut'im, that means he provide food to people. وَلَا يُطْعَمُ, and he is not to be taking food for himself. He does not need that. He is the creator of the heavens and the earth. The same thing when it comes to, many times people, they think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their own from their own perspective. This is evil and this is deviation. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of Him. We get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only from what is mentioned in the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So this is also another meaning of As-Samad. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. And He has no equivalent. There's no equivalent to Him whatsoever. And equivalence meaning that they are the like of Him in power, in status, in whatever. No one has the liking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one is equivalent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, if someone is equivalent, that means they both do not deserve to be worshipped alone, because they're equivalent. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of Him. So, therefore, this is another meaning of As-Samad that we need to basically fill our hearts with, because we are in need of it all the time. And with all the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with being human beings and in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a hadith in Sahih Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah, which also explain this concept and how human beings, they commit so much evil when they claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a son or associate partners with Allah. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a samad, it's a sad thing that people need to have the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them to be guided to the truth. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam said, and this is hadith in Bukhari and others, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, كذبني ابن آدم ولم يكن له ذلك, which means the son of Adam كذبني, that means he belied me. He said opposite to what I informed him of. ولم يكن له ذلك, and it's not befitting the human beings to deny what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or to oppose what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only speaks the truth and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not speak lies. So what is that? And also said in the hadith, وَشَتَمَنِي وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ ذَلِكَ, and the son of Adam shatamani, reviled me, cursed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it does not befit the human beings to do so, because that's the creator of the heavens and the earth. So how can human beings say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not say the truth? Or how can the human beings revile Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or curse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How is that? The hadith says, أَمَّا تَكْذِيبَهُ إِيَّاي, the way that he belies me is أَنْ يَقُولَ إِنِّي لَنْ أُعِيدَهُ كَمَا بَدَأْتُ, that the human being would say that I won't resurrect him after I have created him and initiated him. The one that initiated us in creation, He's the one that would resurrect us, return us back to life after death, in the hereafter, in the everlasting life. This is how people, they say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not saying the truth. And how dare human beings would say this. He's the one that initiated the human beings. And for each and every one of us, when we think, where were we 100 years ago? Assuming that nobody is over 100 or 200 years ago. We do not know anything. Why? Because we did not exist on the face of earth. Who is the one that initiated us? Who's the one that created us? Gave us this life? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We did not give it to our own selves. So the way we are created and we're living and talking and having feelings and pain and happiness and all of these things and concerns and so on, who's the one that can then give us life again? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same way that this life happened to us, is it something difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us life again after we die? This is something that is nothing whatsoever for the creator of the heavens and the earth. The first one, from a human perspective, might look like it's more difficult than the second one. Second one is only resurrecting. But the first one was from nothing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do all things. So this by itself shows the ignorance of the human beings and how they claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not saying the truth. And as the hadith says, how then the son of Adam curses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَمَّا شَتْمَهُ إِيَّاي, as the hadith Qudsi says, and as for cursing me, أَنْ يَقُولَ اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا, when the son of Adam says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a son. وَأَنَا الصَّمَدُ الَّذِي لَمْ أَلِدْ وَلَمْ أُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لِي كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. Samad is mentioned in this hadith. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the son of Adam cursed me, cursing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he's saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a son while I am the Samad. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. How can the human being say that I have a son when I am the Samad. As-Samad, the one, الذي لم ألد ولم أولد, the one that I've never begot nor I was born. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لِي كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ, and there was no equivalent to me. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. So that's the meaning of As-Samad, and it shows how it is such a powerful word and such a great name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if human beings understand it, they would repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from these evil deviation that make them among those who associate partners with Allah. That if people understand this, then they would be upon the Tawheed and upon the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is the creator of all things. The name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, As-Samad, as we heard in the hadith, which is explained in the surah, it shows how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whenever harm afflicts us, and this is how we should then benefit from the name. Who is the one that we should turn to? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again and again, because nobody deserves for us to turn to except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the ummah of the Muslims today, they should turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. There is no need for anyone but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When people seek guidance from the east and the west, when people imitate others and they think great about others, especially with matters of worldly gain, many Muslims are so much attached and amazed of how advanced some nations are and so on because of worldly things. That does not make anybody civilized whatsoever. To be a civilized nation is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, is to be obedient to Allah, is to follow the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, is to have the manners of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam, is to deal with one another with goodness and mercy and so on. But when the heart is only attached to this world, then what happens? The goal becomes the desires of this world, and wealth and sophistications and so on. And it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it doesn't take the person close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's all evil things. It's not evil in itself, but if it takes a person away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it makes a person arrogant and so much busy that he doesn't want to think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and about the purpose of life and so on, then all of that was a fitna for that person, a trial for that person. So therefore it's very crucial for us to understand these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to know that the benefits for us to learn is, one of which, that if harm afflict us, ثُمَّ إِذَا مَسَّكُمُ الضُّرُّ فَإِلَيْهِ تَجْأَرُونَ, that as a fact of life, whenever harm afflicts a person or a nation, they turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Why? Because He's the one that deserves for people to turn to Him, because He is As-Samad. So that's why this is something that this meaning, or that particular specific meaning, was mentioned by Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, As-Samad, he said this, I would read this in Arabic for you. As-Samadu alladhi tasmudu ilayhi al-ashya' idha nazala bihim qurbatun aw bala'. Which means, As-Samad is the one that all matters, all things, tasmudu ilayhi, which means in need of. They stand needing His help and so on, especially when there is calamity or harm afflicts them. And that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one of the meanings of As-Samad that people should do at all times, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most powerful subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we talked about many different meanings here that are mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we need to live our life according to these meanings. So when we said that everybody should be, or everybody is in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so we do that as an action. This is a way to purify our souls. We are in need of Allah when we go to sleep, when we wake up, when we make our salah, when we make dhikr, when we read Quran, when we stay away from sins. We are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We should not rely on our own selves, but rather rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is As-Samad subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that affects the entire life of a Muslim. Also another benefit is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a Sayyid, which is one of the meanings of the word As-Samad, that means everybody else are slaves of Allah. He's the master, and everybody are slaves of Allah. Slaves, they should not rely on one another, they should rely on their master, on their owner, the creator of the heavens and the earth, because they're all in need of Him. And He's the one that is in full control. Therefore, they would have certain meanings in their heart, the fear, the hope, the good expectations, the love, and so on and so forth. And therefore the obedience to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ and so on. So this is another benefit that touches all aspects of our life and not just one thing or the other. The other meaning, as we heard, is Al-Hayyul Qayyum, the ever-living Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we seek everything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because everything else dies except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He is the light subhanahu wa ta'ala that shows the guidance for everyone. And that's why we have to be in need of the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we see again, this is one of the comprehensive names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has so many meanings, as you see. It's not just one meaning. And so many benefits as a result of this. So many names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be present under the name of As-Samad. And one of the great meanings also that, and there are so many actually statements of the companions radiallahu anhum, but one of the things that Abdullah ibn Abbas also radiallahu anhuma, he said about the name As-Samad, that he is As-Sayyid, right? He's the master, that he perfected his, this attribute. Was Sharif, the one that is the most honored, that his sharaf and honor is the most perfect. He is Al-Azim, all of that is the meaning of As-Samad. He is Al-Azim, the most exalted, the one الذي قد كمل في عظمته, the one that is perfect in his exaltation. Al-Halim, the most forbearing, the one that is perfect in his forbearance. Al-Ghani, the most rich, the one that is perfect in his richness, he does not need anyone. He is Al-Jabbar, الذي قد كمل في جبروته, he is the most powerful subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he is perfect in this. He is the most knowledgeable, that his knowledge is most perfect, because he is the owner of all things. He is Al-Hakim, he is the most wise, that his wisdom is the most perfect. These are all names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that some of them we talked about, some of them we didn't talk about. And all of that is the meaning of As-Samad. So he is the one that is perfect in the meanings of honor and master and the creator of the heavens and the earth. And this is his صفة. As he says, وَهُوَ اللَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ هَذِهِ صِفَةُ. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is his attribute. Does not befit anyone, because لَيْسَ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. There is no equivalent to him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing is the like of him. He is the only one, subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of that, as you see, is part of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, As-Samad. Therefore, we just talked about that, but again, we need to take this belief to strengthen our iman, and that's purify our souls. We need to see how evil it is, shirk and associating partners with Allah. We have to have that in our hearts, because the tawheed is the truth, and other than that is falsehood. We have to have this clear in our hearts, to worship none but the creator of the heavens and the earth. And we have to invite people to the tawheed, to be in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Those who worship graves, those who go to peers or whatever there is and they seek help from them, and they think that another human being can benefit them, or going to graves and wiping their bodies on it or their clothes, or seeking blessings from stones or from trees or from whatever there is. All of that negates what a person would say when he says Allahu Samad. We have to take these meanings to affect our hearts and to purify our hearts with the proper belief, with the actions done by the heart, as we heard, and that should show in our life that we're constantly seeking help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how we recite the Quran, this is how we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and to give up on thinking about all the physical means and neglecting the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the owner of all things. We are in need of that as Muslims. We are in need to revisit these verses and re-understand what is the meaning of Qul Allahu Ahad, Allahu Samad, and Surah Al-Fatiha, Ayatul Kursi, the Tawheed of Allah, to be away from shirk and to be obedient to Allah. And this is how we revive our iman, and this is how we become successful in this life and in the hereafter. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who listen and obey the orders of Allah and benefit from what we heard and what we said. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.